Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Courtney Doggart. I'm going to use a microphone so that our folks on Zoom, we have about 100 people joining on Zoom, can hear us as well. So we are the lucky ones. We're in the room. We get the lunch. But we hope everyone else is able to enjoy some food as well. So I just want to first start off. My name is Courtney Doggart. I run Network 2020. We're a nonprofit based in New York that we hold a lot of conversations about global affairs and foreign policy. When we were approached by Christosol to see if we could do some sort of speaking event, we said there's no better place to do this than with the Roosevelt House Institute of Public Policy, with which we've partnered before. And it's a pleasure to be back here again. And so I just want to thank Jessica Newworth, who can't be here, and her team. Jada Richardson has been very helpful. And I also want to thank Brian as well for all the coordination. So I'm just going to introduce our guests very quickly. This will be kind of an informal conversation. They'll share their own thoughts on the topic, which is the rise of authoritarianism in Central America, and then we'll open it up for questions. So just, very briefly, it's a pleasure to introduce Noah Bullock. He has served as the executive director of Christosol in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras since 2010. I told them that I would not read their bios, so I will leave it at that. But needless to say, he has a lot of very relevant experience right now that I think will be that he'll be able to share. And we also have Professor Mark Edelman, who has been on the faculty at Hunter and CUNY Graduate Center for 31 years. I've learned that he is part of the revival of the critical agrarian studies movement, and he teaches right now on social movements and social change. So also a great voice to have at this time. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Noah, and you can share some thoughts, and then we'll hear from Mark as well.
Oh, do I grab this one? Is it on? You hear me okay? Yeah, I think we all can. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Mark and Brian, for putting this together. It's always fun to do these different types of interchanges and talk about, I think, a pretty relevant issue where the people across Latin America, people in the United States are concerned about democratic backsliding. I think in the context of El Salvador, the democracy backslid off a cliff, and I think we can boldly say that we're talking about authoritarianism. And, we've had these types of conversations also with our colleagues in exile from Nicaragua, Venezuela. There's our friends from Venezuela say that when they look at the United States, they feel like they're people from the future. When we began to think in El Salvador that the political project of the current president was an authoritarian political project, we began to talk with Nicaraguans about their experience confronting the Murillo Ortega regime. And so these conversations matter because I think there's a lot of, we hear often that there's a dictator's manual handbook, but we don't often talk enough about resistance to authoritarianism. And I think that there's important lessons to be learned. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I think that in the more recent, like the last few months, or I guess the whole year now, El Salvador, a tiny little country, has been in the news a lot here because of the partnership between the Salvadoran regime and the Trump administration. And it surprised us in El Salvador how we haven't fallen off the media cycle at some point. We were kind of expecting, this will be the last time. And there's just been consistent interest. And my theory about that is that I think when people see what's happened to El Salvador, see what happened to us as a human rights organization, it feels a little bit like a mirror, right? There's a Jesuit theologian and philosopher named Ignacio Ellacuría, who was one of our beloved martyrs in El Salvador. He said that the third world to the first world is an inverted mirror in which the first world can look and see a disfigured image of itself. And I've been thinking about this mirror because I've used that framing for a long time to talk about both the context. And I think we're no longer talking about an inverted mirror. Ellacuría meant by the inverted mirror is that the first world is looking at it from one side and seeing people on the other side of the mirror in terms of the distribution of global power and privilege. And I think we're just looking directly in the mirror now. things like human rights violation, corruption, authoritarianism from a U.S. perspective, or sort of an exceptionalist mentality, is something that happens in other contexts. And now people see that the United States is not immune from that. So there's, I think, interesting new parallels in that way, besides the political relationship between the two governments. Our experience as a human rights organization, we spent the better part of the last 15 years assisting victims of gang violence and narco trafficking groups, people internally displaced by violence in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. We've also litigated cases in representation of victims of crimes against humanity and war crimes from the armed conflict period. And we've been investigating corruption. But I think our context and our sense of mission as a human rights organization was deeply impacted by the Bukele regime. Like I said, when Bukele took office, he came to office through a legitimate election. He has been popular in polls. But from our perspective, as we assessed the ways that he exercised power, he used his electoral victories and his popularity to dismantle the democracy that put an end to the civil war in 1992 in El Salvador. And, talking with some of our staff, especially our staff that lived through the war, we came to the conclusion that the Bukele regime was a project of authoritarianism, and that the responsibility of a human rights organization in such a context is to resist. And so early on in El Salvador, we were one of the critical voices of the regime. We were denouncing and using constitutional litigation at the Supreme Court to check some of the actions that he did. We also came into confrontation with the regime around the prosecution of war crimes when it became evident that that the military was going to form an important part of the government. The president joined the long line of presidents that protected the military from accountability for war crimes in the previous generation. And I think what we were seeing, and especially the first 3 years, was the capture of different institutions of the state that were autonomous, that were set up to some degree or other to protect the rights of people, to be counterweights on executive power. When he won a legislative majority, the very first night they overthrew the magistrates of the Supreme Court. They overthrew the Attorney General that was investigating corruption during the pandemic and the relationship between the Bukele regime and the leadership of the Mara Salvatrucha, and installed loyalists. And then they passed reforms to purge judges from the lower courts. And when those things were happening, we were warning the population in the world that when the institutional checks on power are gone, when the institutions that are set up to serve the citizenry and protect now serve the interest of the regime, then conditions existed for atrocities. That's our history. Democracy is an imperfect form of government. It's definitely corruptible. It definitely has committed human rights violations in different contexts and different times. But it is the form of government that's put in place that gives people, citizens, the opportunity to protect themselves or to seek redress, a recourse. And when those things are gone, then the citizenry finds themselves exposed to the repressive power of the state without protections. And so that was one of the concerns that we had as we saw the democratic state collapse under the Bukele regime. And 3 years ago in March, there was a massacre of 80 people over the course of a weekend. And this was attributed to the gangs. Violence is the form of political communication by the gangs, and the gangs had been in a long-term partnership with the Bukele regime since the president was a mayor. And there would be periodic outbreaks of violence, and that would be the way for them to communicate that they wanted to reassess or negotiate the partnership. And President Bukele declared in response to this massacre a state of exception, a state of emergency in which constitutional rights were suspended. The Salvadoran Constitution permits temporary states of emergency and the restriction of some fundamental rights, but the Bukele regime's state of emergency was expansive. And so since the imposition of the state of exception, 90,000 Salvadorans have been arbitrarily detained in 3 years. That's almost 2% of the population. The majority of those people are held in prisons without access to their families or attorneys. So they are, according to the international standard, in a situation of forced disappearance. Our organization has documented systematic practices of torture in prisons that have caused the killing of at least 450 people, according to our investigations. We think it's probably many more. And so our warning about the lack of protections of the citizenry and the potential for producing atrocity has come to fruition during the state of exception. When a state systematically, arbitrarily detains en masse, when it disappears people into prisons, when it tortures, and when it kills, that commits crimes against humanity. Those are 4 of the crimes that constitute crimes against humanity. And that was something that we warned throughout the state of exception. The continuation of this policy could constitute crimes against humanity. And now we have the conviction as an organization, based on the evidence that we pulled together, that they have committed crimes against humanity. This is the prison system that was developed during the state of exception. It transforms the criminal justice system, specifically the prison system, from one in a democracy that should impose punishment, but also create opportunities for rehabilitation and reintegration. The logic now of the prison systems in El Salvador is to create a system of permanent separation, punishment, an indefinite imprisonment of people accused of crimes. The reforms to the penal system that went along with this allow for people to be held in pretrial detention for 7 years. And we'll see how much longer that goes. They've created secret ad hoc tribunals to try them and reformed the penal code so that they can be tried in mass of groups of 1,000 or more people. So in short, I go into detail to describe this, not because it's necessarily unique to El Salvador or this specific moment. In Salvador's history, all of the dictatorships have ruled based on using emergencies and states of exception. This is a commonality. This is part of the dictator's handbook, to create the sense that in a society there is an emergency. The source of that emergency is usually attributed to a group of internal enemies that should not be protected by law, and that the president should therefore be afforded extraordinary powers to eliminate that group. And what we also know about from history is that at the beginning, they select groups of people that the society feels comfortable or accepts the loss of rights. But what we've learned is that when a government has decided to take the rights of one group of people, even if they're different from you, even if you don't agree with them, or you might mistrust that group of people, they've already decided to take the rights away from every citizen. This is the slippery slope that we see repeated throughout history. And in the case of El Salvador, this prison system that has the capability of operating outside of rule of law, of committing crimes against humanity with impunity, is the prison system that this year was contracted by the United States to disappear migrants as part of a strategy of terror against the migrant population here, to deter migrants from coming to the country. And I think one of the reflections that we made when we saw the flight of 250 Venezuelans and 20 Salvadorans come to El Salvador is it's strange because the United States doesn't lack cells or prison detention facilities. Why did they need to hire the Salvadoran government to detain people? And I think the clear conclusion of that is that the United States government in this case wasn't looking for expanded detention facilities. They were looking for detention facilities precisely that operate outside of any protections of the law. So that people, one of the maybe lessons learned from Guantanamo is even when the United States sent prisoners to Guantanamo, they were under the jurisdiction of military law. But when they disappeared them into the terrorist confinement center in El Salvador, they were not under any jurisdiction. People who had never formally been accused of any crime, who had never had a single day in court, were disappeared into a maximum security prison. Our legal team presented 80 habeas corpus claims to the Salvadoran Supreme Court to demonstrate that there was no jurisdiction that could oversee their detention in El Salvador. And through this partnership, the United States signed a contract and became accomplice to, again, crimes against humanity. Now that the Venezuelans have been returned to their country of origin, and we have gathered testimonies of over 137 of them, and they provide testimonial evidence that is very compelling, photographic and other forensic evidence to demonstrate that they were also victims of torture, sexual abuse, psychological torture, systematic denial of access to basic necessities like food, medicine, and all of that links the United States. Probably since Iraq, I don't think the United States policy has been linked to systematic torture on this scale. And again, that is another instance of crimes against humanity. I think I'll close by saying that our organization, when we made the decision to resist the autocratic project in El Salvador, to accompany victims, to build an evidentiary base to defend truth, that came with consequences as well. Our lead attorney of our anti-corruption unit, Ruth Lopez, the attorney that also led the work to present the habeas corpus claims on behalf of the Venezuelans, was arrested outside her home on May 18th. She's been held incomunicado in a maximum security prison since July 4th. She was arrested as part of a crackdown against human rights organizations that began in May. She has been declared a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International, together with Alejandro Enriquez, Jose Angel Perez, two human rights defenders that were also arrested in accompaniment of a community of peasants, farmers who were asking for the president's help get to defend themselves against an eviction order. And after Ruth's detention, another friend of ours, a constitutional lawyer named Enrique Anaya, was arrested. He is also being held incomunicado in a prison in El Salvador. And so what we've learned from that process is that the extraordinary measures that were promised to provide security for the Salvadoran people are now the same measures that are being used to persecute human rights defenders in prison. The exceptions to due process are the ones that are now being applied to Ruth and her other friends and colleagues in prison. And the crackdown was accompanied with the announcement of a foreign agent law, similar to the Putin model in Russia. And together with the reality that the Salvadoran government has arbitrarily detained and disappeared 90,000 people over the last 3 years. Nobody was in El Salvador is confused about the reality that the government can detain whoever it wants, and there are no institutions that can intervene. The detentions of the human rights defenders was a message is a violence committed against critical voices. But a violence committed against the whole of society to send a message of what will be tolerated and what won't be tolerated in El Salvador. Their detentions and the systematic harassment, monitoring, the threats that were made to us and other members of the human rights community produced a wave of exile. We don't know the final number of people, but I believe that there are hundreds of people that since May have fled the country, mostly to Guatemala, Mexico, Spain. And that's the situation that we are in as an organization. We had to relocate 20 of our staff from El Salvador to Guatemala. And now we are reorganizing ourselves in a situation of exile. We are cognizant of the costs of political persecution to us personally, the impacts in society. But we also feel confidence from our reading of history that dictators are always they have a twisted understanding of human rights. They think that they are, or they like to try and convince people that they are a globalist agenda, that they are part of, they're in positions of national security, that there's something foreign to destabilize and disrupt the true will of the people reflected in the supreme leader. But in reality, human rights are unique to all of our stories, all of our experiences as people, as communities, as families. There's not a single generation that hasn't dreamed of greater freedom and equality. And there's a single generation that doesn't have people who has tried to take action so that might be. And no regime of repression has ever stopped people from dreaming of a better world and taking action so it might be. So we feel motivated by that legacy, that this won't last forever. When Ruth was detained at her house, that's what she said to her arresting officers. They began to get rough with her and trying to put handcuffs on her. And she said, "Tengan decencia. Un día todo esto se va a acabar." She said, "Have decency. One day all of this will end." And so that's what we continue to advocate, to document, to accompany victims, to provide protection for people who need it, because one day all of this will end.
Thank you, Noah. That was terrific. It's good to see you again and welcome you to Roosevelt House. Quick thank you to Brian and Jada and Courtney for setting up the program. Is this on? I guess it's on. I wanted to zoom back a little bit in time and outward a little bit geographically. We're talking about a region where there is a pretty long tradition of authoritarianism, going back certainly to the 19th century. Hernandez Martinez in El Salvador, Carillas in Honduras, Ubico in Guatemala, and so on, Somozas in Nicaragua. And I think one of the things that makes the contemporary authoritarianism a bit different is the technological change that has occurred since then. And from what I understand, one of the things that the Bukele regime has done is to intervene the phones of human rights defenders and other people that they didn't like with Pegasus software, this Israeli software that was developed and you can put on somebody's phone without them even being aware of it. So I think the technology of social control has ramped up in some very significant ways, making this kind of repression in some ways more effective. So I'd be interested to hear your reflections on that. The other thing that I think maybe needs to be stated a little more explicitly is that these authoritarians learn from each other. You know, Trump is learning from Bukele and vice versa. They're both learning from Putin. They're learning from Ortega Murillo. These laws limiting the scope of foreign-funded human rights organizations and other NGOs. It's not just Putin, it's Orban in Hungary. The Nicaraguans had a law like this quite a few years ago, I believe. So it's a form of shutting down political space even more and quieting civil society and impoverishing the movements of civil society. And a couple other comments in relation to your observations about authoritarianism. It seems to me, and I suppose that there are political scientists who have studied this, that these modern day elected authoritarians tend to get substantially worse at the point when they extend their term limits. When they overcome the Constitution and extend their term limits beyond what is permitted, then they feel that they've won something big and they can let loose. So I'd be interested to hear any observations on that. And I think the other thing that maybe needs to be said in relation to the contract of the U.S. administration with Bukele to put people in Secot and so on, it's not just that they're putting it into a space that's outside the law, it's the spectacle that it creates. It's Christine Nome going down there and posing in front of the cell with all these guys. It's the humiliation that is inflicted in a spectacular way on deportees and other prisoners, shaving their heads, making them kneel down almost naked, closely packed together. I think these images are very, very powerful, and I think that's part of the reason for doing this kind of thing. So any
Yeah, I mean, that's you summarized many of the most important sort of issues to draw out on. I'll start with the idea of a model. I think that one of the things that the Bukele regime desires more than anything is to be recognized as a model of governance, of security, crypto coins. He likes to tweet to the United States about how he's a model for overthrowing judges and encourages the Republicans to do the same thing. He did that like a week ago. And there's a powerful narrative behind the model. There's not a country in Latin America whose political processes right now aren't in some way or other debating the model of Bukele. And part of the enchantment of the model is this idea that it's something new. I think that the vice president says in kind of absurd statements that he said to the Times actually that they weren't dismantling democracy, they were destroying it and going to replace it with something better. The advent of Nayib Bukele is, the beginning of a new republic, the first democracy to ever fully exist in El Salvador. It's the same thing that Xi says in China. The Chinese system is more democratic than the Western system. And when we look at President Bukele, it's a frustrating scenario because far from being a model of something new, he looks exactly like all the dictators from El Salvador's history that preceded. You mentioned Martinez, Quiñones, whatever it would be. There are two commonalities. One, every dictator in El Salvador, since its independence, the Constitution has prohibited immediate re-election of the president. And it's in the Salvadoran political system, one of the principal checks on executive power. President Bukele said it himself when he was a candidate. He said that you can be elected president 80 times if you want, but just not 2 times in a row. So the interruption of a re-election is one of the ways that the political system of El Salvador puts a check on executive power. And all dictators have sought to re-elect themselves. And now President Bukele has reformed the Constitution to allow for indefinite presidential re-election. Re-election allows presidents in our system to not only control the executive, but then move to control the electoral system and other parts of the democracy that create a series of checks and balances. And the second part is, like I already said, ruling based on states of emergency, permanent ones. But probably the deeper commonality is even more sad, is that what you see is beyond like a political model, a model of exercising power and concentrating power around elite groups of families. The Bukeles and their allies have supplanted the old power structures and created a new political system that benefits their families. And so we have now a return to an authoritarian model of governance that privileges groups of elite families. They govern without transparency, without checks on their power, without accountability, without dialogue, for sure. And that's the same thing that led the country to its civil war. It's the same political model that led the country to its worst moments, darkest moments of atrocity. The 1932 genocide, for example, was perpetrated by Martinez, who then became a dictator. And so there's a sense of sadness that what's being presented as new is in reality a return to the form of governance that's led the country to its worst moments. That's reproduced the inequalities, and yet, if you look at the polls, Salvadorans tend to think of Bukele himself as a model of the future, and that's part of what you were also mentioning: the effectiveness of the use of social media and political communications. They've been able to create an archetype of a leader, and this is not new either. El Salvador, for the last few decades, is, I think you could say, a nation that has been humiliated by corruption, by generations of immigration, forced immigration, by gang violence. It consistently is on the list of the worst things of all the countries in the world. And then there emerges this young leader who says that I can uniquely save the country, I can restore its dignity, I can reposition it as a model of a country and not a country at the bottom of the list. And that's particularly powerful for people, for example, in the diaspora, and they built an emotional connection with the population through a massive propaganda apparatus. They produce between 100 and 200 hours of video a day. And the propaganda apparatus is backed by absolute control over public information. There's no longer a political party of opposition, and functionally, it's a single party state. And that's important because it's not like you're having debates in the Congress or forming commissions to investigate pacts with gangs or mass corruption, the disappearance of $1.3 billion during the pandemic. None of these things get discussed in public. You also have the exercise of control over the military and the return of the military to the political life of the country. You see the military being a prop in the propaganda machine. They just recently named a minister for education who's a military officer. And she, it's an interesting form of punitive populism where the president in his speeches and things like that have tried to create the sense that the education system is being reformed. They handed out iPads a few years ago, or not iPads, but tablets a few years ago. He promised the remodeling of a school every single day, and then it became like a few schools a week. And then right after they captured Ruth, he promised one school a month, but they haven't been able to remodel schools because there's no money. They've had to fire hundreds of teachers because there's no money for it. So the substitution of this sense of order and discipline is to substitute actual political policy is the continuation of mano durismo, right? Mano dura security policies, where instead of having a long-term commitment of a society to transform conflict, you send out the military, you militarize it, and people feel like order and security is sufficient. And so these are the powerful narratives that they've very effectively been able to put into place. And then about learning, these narratives, I think El Salvador has become a soft power because of the effectiveness of the narratives. I mentioned that the Bukele model is in dispute in every electoral process in Latin America, and you mentioned this too. You hear President Trump saying Bukele lines of his own in his speeches. When he militarized Washington, D.C., I remember President Trump saying that people can now cross the street and go to restaurants, and new restaurants are opening. That's exactly the same thing that the Bukele regime celebrates in El Salvador. And so in the case of the Secot too is, I think, a really unique example of that, because even for President Bukele, Secot is a prop. It's a prison that was built in the context of the state of exception. It was It didn't exist before. And as soon as it was open, it's the stage where they begin to film all of their videos. And in Secot, people aren't fully aware of this, but the prisoners that you originally saw in the videos from Secot their physical appearance, and it has nothing to do with isn't consistent with the profile of people who are actually being detained in the state of exception. Those are most the faces of older gang members who have been in prison for a long time. But you pick the fully tattooed bodies and you put them in these cruel positions as a message of your cruelty to a hated group of people. It was the stage, and they were the props, and the prison is a prop to reinforce the narrative of the internal enemy that justifies the abuse, it justifies the cruelty. And that was precisely the service that was contracted by the United States. Christine Nom went down to Secot, and she didn't stand in front of the cell of the Venezuelan migrants. She stood in front of the cell and gave her press conference standing in front of those same older gang members with the names of the tattoos on their heads and chests, to eliminate any doubt that even if you're uncomfortable with the cruelty and the brutality that you're seeing in it, you could feel okay because it was done against them, and they're the bad people. The idea, the imagery of a monster, right? And so all of that's intentional, and that's a way that's unique to the partnership between Bukele and President Trump, is that Bukele created an apparatus, he created a narrative, he had these props that were very useful for the narrative of an internal enemy in the United States, who in this case is the migrants, who during the campaign President Trump promised were a threat to national security. They tried to use the idea that the Tren de Aragua Venezuelan gang was a threat to U.S. national security, and then justifies the strategy of mass arbitrary detention in the United States, and then disappear. And I think the disappearance itself is one of the more, to the Salvadoran prison, is one of the more shameful things from the perspective of El Salvador, because El Salvador itself is a country of migrants. And that the president of the country doesn't use his popularity to defend rights and protect migrants, rather to become the coercive tool of a campaign of terror against them, is shameful. So you provoked me a little bit, but and you gave me a really long question, and I gave you a really long answer.
Yes. You mentioned the tweet in which Bukele is urging Trump to fire judges that rule against him, even though, of course, some of those judges were judges that Trump actually appointed. It seems to me that this is indicative of a bigger problem, which is erosion of a certain kind of democratic sensibility and international diplomacy, that you don't interfere in the judicial system of another country. But it follows right on the heels of what Trump was trying to do to Alexandre de Moraes in Brazil, who was the prosecutor going after Bolsonaro. So I think, this is one of those kinds of deterioration that's happening in the international environment, and one of the ways in which these characters are building off of each other and ping-ponging back and forth, doing these kinds of things. This thing about term limits and interrupted rule, and then you can get another term and so on. This is right out of the Putin playbook, because Putin ran up against term limits at one point. And all of a sudden, he wasn't president anymore. He was prime minister, and Medvedev became president for one term. And then they fixed that. And now Putin is, president until he discovers the fountain of immortality that he's after. So I think there's that. I wanted to ask you, in terms of this media campaign and propaganda campaign that you described, shortly before, I guess a year or maybe 2 years before you and Cristosal had to leave El Salvador, El Faro, this very interesting alternative media outlet, online newspaper that had been around for at least a couple decades, I think, also had to leave. I think they went to Costa Rica, if I remember right. I don't know if anybody actually read El Faro except people in the exterior. Yeah, like me. They even had an English edition for you monolingual Americans. But I'm wondering if that was a significant moment in terms of the tightening political space. So.
Yeah, I'd like to backtrack a little bit on that idea that you were mentioning, that the contradiction and hypocrisy of, one moment saying, demanding that a government complies with its treaty obligations to human rights is an imposition of national sovereignty. But when they feel like it, they can tweet out about how the United States should overthrow courts, right? Members of Bukele's government were in Guatemala a week ago, endorsing practically a political party. They've done a similar thing in Costa Rica. The president of Costa Rica, apparently, I haven't seen this, but friends of mine in Costa Rica told me that he has a photo of him with President Bukele at the airport. And so this, how do you explain the hypocrisy in a different way than just the outrage, oh, these guys are just hypocritical? And it has to do with how authoritarians construct legitimacy. You heard this at the beginning of the Trump administration too, but Bukele and others say that they are legitimate because they were elected, and the election gave them a mandate, and they represent uniquely the will of the people, and that any institution or check on their power is not only wrong or an act of political opposition or natural to the system of Republican governance, it's a threat to the will of the people. I was sitting with President Bukele in a table set up similar to this. He was right here and I was right here. I had to sit there for 4 hours next to him. And in that meeting, he said, I was asking him about how he used his microphone as a president to divide the country, to say that there are good people and bad people when he could unite the country around common values. And his response was that I don't influence the thinking of the people. I'm a reflection of it. And so when people use and manipulate this idea of a mandate, that they uniquely represent the will of the people, then they can easily say that the courts that try and block me are anti-democratic, they're unrepresentative of the people, that they're the problem, they're corrupt. They can say the same about legislatures. They can say the same about human rights. And so it's an important thing to be able to name, is the way that authoritarians construct the narrative of legitimacy. If you ask me, I hear this all the time, because especially up until more recently with like the exiles and political persecution, but people would say that, yeah, okay, so there's cost to security, that there was a security outcome, and that comes at a necessary cost. And how do you justify that? And I would say that I had to learn how to find a simple way to answer it, but I would say now that the Salvadoran people deserve to live free from the tyranny of gangs, but also deserve something better than the tyranny of dictatorship. Those are two bad options, and not necessarily as a sort of a false dichotomy. But the thing about legitimacy too is that we should question, do elections alone give legitimacy? Do success in polls give legitimacy, or are they reflections of the concentration of power itself? Does a government, when they torture and rape children, lose the legitimacy to continue governing? When torture becomes a state policy, is a government, even if it continues to be popular, legitimate? And if we're being really honest about our history as humans, most governments that carry out mass human rights violations in the moment had some sort of popular support. That's not unique. And so I think it's important to think about the sources of legitimacy. In the ideal scenario of a human rights system, an international human rights system, to continue to govern legitimately, you should accept the limits that human rights put on the exercise of power, not say that you are unique to surpass them. That's I'm going a little bit off topic, but it's an interesting, like you asked a question that scratches the surface of something that's a little bit deeper. About Alfaro, Bukele has, we have to also remember that this wave of repression, this crackdown in May, is just like the most recent wave. The moment that he took office, he sought to use the criminal justice system as a political weapon. And most of us, I include myself in that, were somewhat indifferent about that, because he first went after the old political guard. And, in Spanish, we would say nobody wants to put their hand in the fire for them. That being indifferent to the abuse of due process rights to the old political guard in El Salvador was in some ways the society accepting that would then become the norm for all people. That first they went after the political opposition. I think there's probably real judicial causes against them. But when we look at people like Neto Mason, who spent like 6 years in prison without a conviction, physically clearly being tortured, that's no longer a legitimate use of judicial authority. That's punishment of political enemies. That's political violence in itself, even if those people probably should have spent some time in jail. And then they went after the people that opposed Bitcoin. They went after the people, the veterans that were organizing marches. They went after the leaders of the anti-mining movement. They went after human rights defenders. And also in the state of exception, it's an interesting use of a security strategy to whitewash the mass detention of people. How many in the communities, for example, around Secot? The Secot has no water treatment facilities. There's a community there is a farming community. Secot begins to dump the sewage into the river. Their cattle die. Their wells are contaminated, and they ask the government to help them clean the river. And then the soldiers come and detain people in the community under the state of exception. The people feel like it's because we made that request that the reprisal was detention, arbitrary detention. Another community is organized as a cooperative that lost a lot of their lands, expropriated for the building of the prison. And they said, if you continue to take our lands, our cooperative won't be viable. Can you please not? So they arrest one of the children of the president of the cooperative. So even in the state of exception, there's at least 20 or so labor union leaders. There's community leaders. There are family members who denounced abuses, and then more family members of theirs were captured. So we have a series of waves of exile and political persecution, and I guess that it mirrors that poem about Nazi Germany. It's easy when they came for the labor unions. I wasn't one, so I said nothing. At the end of the day, nobody was there to defend me, and it's something that history doesn't rhyme; it repeats itself, according to Mark Twain.
So legitimacy, I think, in a democracy derives significantly from institutions, and not just the vote, but from the day-to-day functioning of state institutions in a non-biased, impartial way. And of course, this doesn't exist there. And one of the troubling things, if we look elsewhere in Central America for a moment, there are at least a couple of countries that now have presidents who are arguably fairly progressive. I'm thinking Arevalo in Guatemala, Xiomara Castro in Honduras. But the institutions are widely viewed accurately as extraordinarily corrupt. So people feel justifiably excluded from the political system, even when there is an effort to address some of the popular discontent with authoritarianism that existed before. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about, I recall seeing polls a while ago that Bukele was by far the most popular head of state in Latin America. And I think now maybe it's Claudia Sheinbaum, I'm not sure. But I think that popularity that he experienced and still to some extent experiences reflects a very real problem in all these societies of social exclusion, violence, marginality, and so forth. And I think we need to think a little bit, how do these kinds of things end? There's this appealing, but I think somewhat naive idea around now that you can overthrow an unpopular government or an authoritarian government if you get 3.5% of the populace into the street. This is Erica Chenoweth at Harvard. Everybody's all excited about this. I'm quite skeptical of it. And then there are other people who've looked comparatively at fascist regimes and point out that there is hardly a single fascist regime in history that ended except by a military coup or a war. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what the end game is here.
Well, I'll give some thought and reflection about whether Xiomara Castro is progressive. I have my serious doubts, but that wasn't the point. I think that you're bringing up she is her own thing. Agreed. But the idea I think that you're bringing up is that that there is in Guatemala. I think about 3 weeks ago there was a poll that said about like 70% of the population would accept dictatorship if it meant security. And that was something similar in El Salvador. That there was a sense of that people prefer to have a level of sense of security than to have freedoms of a democracy. And I think that the truth about that, and we should defend democracy and rights with much humility, because the majority of people have never benefited equally from democracy and human rights. Those are still not realities there's been much progress. It's touched the progress has touched probably most people in the world, but not equally and not to the point where people are willing to defend those institutions. And that's one of the mistakes I think that in processes of concentration of power, democratic forces make the assumption that democracy is morally better. The human rights standards and sort of the abstract concepts of rule of law and due process are morally better, and sooner or later people will agree with us. Bukele has shown us that that's not how collective beliefs are built, and it's not necessarily what people think about the political systems they live in. They feel frustrated by them. The democracies have been imperfect, they've been corrupted. And what happens in those processes of concentrating power is like progressive groups find themselves in this ironic position where they're defending the status quo. We felt like that. All of a sudden, and it was really easy for the regime to be like, yeah, these guys are aligned with the old guard, the corrupt old guard, because they're defending the political system of the status quo. And so we have to, I wish we could have known or learned this faster, but when progressive or democratic actors try and defend democratic institutions and human rights, we need to do it not only denouncing, saying, oh, no, these guys are authoritarians, they're going to take away your freedoms in your courts. No, we have to be able to, the human rights movement needs to learn not only to be able to denounce and say no, but to present and propose a radical sort of reform agenda to save the institutions, not just sort of carte blanche defend them. That's something that has to be thought of a little bit more. I was in a meeting in Uruguay with different people from around Latin America a couple of weeks ago, talking about defending civic space. What is civic space? What is that? It was at this point it feels like it's an invention for NGOs, and like how many people like sit at home and they're like, I'm really glad there's some civic space still. But that's because we're not the perspective of those who defend civic space is maybe self-referential, number one, and misunderstands how people actually do need civic space. For example, in El Salvador, the right to the freedom of association is the way that people who have been on the unequal end of the exercise of power have been able to exercise rights, organizing constantly. Most communities that have water, that have roads, that have power, is because the communities organized and did it. That's the right to association. That's how those people were able to use that right and use civic space to organize. Now in El Salvador, people who do that and find themselves making requests or proposals or even denouncing something of the regime become grouped into the internal enemy category. So I say that just as an example of like when we have to be able to take these concepts, civic space, rule of law, due process, and understand how they're materialized in the lives of people. For example, due process rights. Nobody is ever going to go and march to the cathedral in San Salvador to defend due process. But we've had lots of marches of mothers who dream of a world in which the state cannot come and kidnap their children and disappear them into prisons. It's the same thing, but it's how it's felt by people, right? And so the defense of rights needs to identify itself in the lives of people and not at the level of treaty bodies and articles of constitutions. So that's something we have thought a lot about. What was the other question? What were I think you had another one at the end there that was
questions from people here, or maybe even
mm-hmm.
Following up on those last points, you talked about people, mothers going to march to the cathedral to defend their children and against a state that abuses their children. One of the issues that Bukele and other authoritarians like Trump support themselves with is the control of crime. And that is something which we didn't really discuss now. That is, how does a human rights defending organization frame the issue of crime, which was one of the major ones in El Salvador and in Central America?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And I'll link it to what I was saying before. In some ways, the human rights movement has positioned itself on the issue of security as the ones that say, no, you can't do that. But we haven't been able to come up with a very clear and communicatable way to talk about what is this democratic security that we think would be better. So I think that that's one of the major things that has to be worked through. But I'll stop there for a second to go back to like the bigger point, which is that we shouldn't be confused, or we shouldn't allow ourselves to be put in that false dichotomy of the only option is either living under the tyranny of criminal organizations or living under the tyranny of dictatorship. And we should also remember that dictatorship, authoritarianism, is organized crime that is even more dangerous because they have the power of the state. And Bukele is a model of how authoritarianism is organized crime. Just his partnership with the gangs, his political career, his popularity is built in a partnership with the leaders of the Mara Salvatrucha. Not because I say that, because Trump's own Justice departments who opened investigations and have presented indictments, they say that, they write it out. It's very clear. And the way that they use the state, it's not just like that they want power. They want power to create privilege and benefits. And they actually have to sustain the concentration of power by creating benefits for the people who are complicit with their crimes. We just produced a report about corruption in the prisons. And the guards, the family members have to bring food, they have to bring medicine, they have to bring clothing to the prisons. And a lot of that is stolen. The families are clear that in prisons, their family members don't have those basic necessities guaranteed. And after almost 4 years now, most families are unsure if their family members are still alive. And that puts them in a position of desperation in which they're willing to pay thousands of dollars to try and get visits, or they bring whatever the guards ask for in exchange for that, the hope for a visit. There is a massive, and that demand based on desperation has created an illicit economy within the prisons that, it has captured millions of dollars of some of the poorest families in the country. I bring that up as an example. It's kind of on a smaller scale when you compare the amount of theft that happens at the higher levels. But in the case of the prisons, the people, the material actors who collaborate with arbitrary detention, torture, and killings collect their quota from the families of their victims. And so authoritarianism is organized crime from the state. El Salvador is not unique. It's not a new model. It's a model of corruption and brutality that's consistent with other dictatorships in the world. And so you feel Salvadorans are correct in saying they feel more safe and more secure from the threat of the gangs, but now they are absolutely unprotected by the arbitrary exercise of power of the regime. And that doesn't affect people necessarily on a daily basis in the way that when the gangs are waiting for you on the corner did. And I would argue that, nevertheless, everyone in El Salvador, consciously or unconsciously, has altered the way that they live. The people in people tell pollsters that they approve the president's his job approval, but the similar majorities also say that they would be afraid to express an opinion that's not aligned with the president's party. And so you have a country that says, yeah, sure, I like the president, but I wouldn't tell you if I didn't, because there would clearly be a reprisal. So that clarity that there is a reprisal for thinking, for dissenting, for doing something not aligned with the regime is a constant violence that shouldn't be undermined in relation to the comparative analysis with gang violence. I'm not trying to say that we don't have to take seriously the need to look at security and provide alternatives for security through democratic means. In Guatemala, the Arevalo government, I think, is about to face its worst crisis. There have been a series of uprisings in the prisons because they transferred some of the leadership of the gangs to different prisons, and then the bases of the gangs began to protest. And then it came out that I think about 20 members of the 18 gang have escaped prison. And so now the political opposition has all of the fuel and power to say it's time for a Bukele, right? Mm-hmm. And so what is the response? How can we respond effectively to a real security need without falling into the trap of having to pay the cost of all of our freedoms and democracy? 1 in every 56 Salvadorans is in prison. 90,000 people of the 120,000 people in prison have been there for almost 4 years without convictions. That is a massive loss of freedom. The authorities in El Salvador tell those people that they'll never leave the prisons walking, right? This is a continuation of another historical pattern of extermination, but this is by other means. Instead of direct killing, this is extermination by separation, permanent separation. So I think we've made that point here, but I also think that human rights organizations need to be able to start saying yes to things like, this is probably the most hypocritical, contradictory thing that I've ever said in public before. But I think maybe President Arevalo should have a state of exception in the prisons in Guatemala to establish control. When Sanchez Serén declared a state of exception in the prisons in El Salvador, people forget this part of history, but there was a state of exception in El Salvador in place for 5 years. The sectors of the prisons where gangs were not allowed to leave their cells for 5 years. And we were part of the commission to enter the maximum security prisons. We were the first people to enter after 5 years to sort of verify the conditions. I've never seen human beings in such deplorable conditions in my life. And when we interviewed, just even like thinking about this, that we interviewed directors of the prisons and the guards, that's unthinkable these days, but we did. And all of them said that, yes, the state of exception was effective. And were able to reestablish control in the prisons in 3 months. But the rest of it was excessive and has undermined the prison itself. And so there are tools at our disposal that can be used to concentrate power, but also can be effective to establish security when the legal limits are respected. And so I think we need to start, I'm not proposing states of exception, but my point when bringing this up is that human rights organizations cannot just have this absolute position of no, not this, not that. There has to be some things. I think most likely we need to learn more about Colombia. I think it's not working great. But in our context in Central America, what's needed is a sort of a transitional justice approach. We need to have international cooperation to have sophisticated investigations capacity, intelligence to target and dismantle the leadership of the gangs and the criminal organizations, and then create different sort of differential justice options for just the kids on the street who are sort of caught up in it, and to be options to be able to reintegrate them into society. I think that some sort of framing around that would be useful. You asked about that end game too. How does it all end? What are the strategies? I've been asking that to like the Venezuelans and the Nicaraguans too, especially since we left the country. What's your theory of change when an authoritarian regime is entrenched? What do you do now? And I don't think that there's in probably when you're seeking historic change, there's not a direct line in the planning and the timing that your actions you would be able to measure in producing the change you're looking for. When it gets more, the Venezuelans say you have to stress all the institutions all the time. Kind of like think about like metamorphic rocks, like constant heat and pressure and things transform, but probably not the day after the march, right? Like things have a way, history has a way of accumulating. And in that, I think the most important thing for us right now is to affirm democracy in the institutions that are not state institutions, democracy in the communities, at the churches, student movements, environmental movements, but understanding that right now confronting the regime is not strategic. Just sort of affirming people, building capacity, maintaining the light of democracy at a very local and not necessarily very public way, so that when conditions change, there is capacity there to be able to promote a democratic transition. That's just one part of it, but I think that that's something that's universal to think about. That not in every context, in every moment, can we be organizing to confront. Sometimes we have to organize to build the fabric of the democracy that we dream of in the future.
Yeah, maybe.
We didn't take them.
Oh, okay. No, they're both just comments.
I can keep the microphone closer.
And one more question. Okay. The comment just says, I particularly resonate with your contention that we should move away from the NGOification of jargon, closing civic spaces, and understand how this is experienced by people in their day-to-day life. So the person is an anthropologist and also ex-USAID from Central America and Mexico team. So your comments resonate, and they're grateful for your vision and leadership.
I'll just react to that really quickly. I do think with like the withdrawal of U.S. foreign assistance to like the anti-corruption, transparency, democracy, human rights space, we're going to see in the next year a radical transformation of civic space, where it's been dominated by professionals and NGOs and organizations. I think that increasingly it will be dominated by volunteer civic movements, social movements, and those are the organizations like ours that will survive. Need to be reprogramming ourselves to be allies and tools to support those movements, which I think will be more important for democracy than NGOs going forward.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Hannah Mejia. I'm a student at the Macaulay Honors College at City College. My father is actually Honduran, so this debate about rising authoritarianism in Central America is very big in my household. And I kind of wanted to touch on the Bukele model. I see a lot of Salvadorians around me kind of idolize Bukele, right? They have this perception that he's sort of cleaned up their country. He is attracting more tourism, investment, and, you know, that he's kind of changed the world's perspective on El Salvador. And I don't see this just with Salvadorians. I also see it with Hondurans. I was just in Honduras a little over a month ago, and when I was talking to my family and friends, they really idolize Bukele as well, and they feel like they need something like that they need an authoritarian regime. But I also saw a connection between their education level and whether or not they support authoritarianism. And I found that a lot of people that lack education and didn't really go to higher education tend to side more with authoritarianism. So how do you go about educating regions in the world where there's such a lack of resources and education, and, you know, they're kind of like stuck, I guess, like years ago, you know, like it's a very different world than here. And I don't know, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on like how we kind of go about educating these small communities.
Yes, very big is a. Oh, sorry. This is also happening in the United States, pretty obviously with Trump. You have over 40% of people who are going to and are supporting some of the most outrageous policies that he's implementing. And many of these are highly educated people. We're better educated, in quotes. I use the word carefully educated, not necessarily well educated than much of the world. And that's not working here necessarily. So I'd like to sort of add your comments to that. Part of it is the messaging issue that even a relatively well-educated person really doesn't, quite frankly, know that due process means equitable process, meaning you need to treat everybody the same. They don't know what it means.
If I could just add on to that, I think it's not quite so simple in the United States. There is the so-called diploma divide, which is real. But on the other hand, we here who are experiencing this have to remember that 77 million people voted for Trump, and it was really many different sectors of the population with many different motivations.
So the model, we talked about it a little bit, but there's, I think, a historic myth about authoritarianism that seems to be hard to bury definitively. And that is this idea that democracy is bureaucratic and corrupt and slow. But if one person were in charge, they could get shit done. Am I allowed to say shit? And, you know, like that Mussolini made the trains run on time. But he also ripped out the fingernails of his political opposition in torture chambers. Pinochet modernized the Chilean economy and built highways, but he, you know, dropped his opposition in the sea from airplanes. Fujimori defeated Sendero Luminoso, but he also was convicted as a war for crimes against humanity. And so there is this continuation of a myth. And there's probably in each one of those countries people who still think Mussolini was good. And I know there's people who still think Pinochet was good. And Fujimori's daughter still wants to be the president. And the same with Guatemala, with the daughter of Rios Montt. She wants to still be the president. There's people that would support her. So this is not, we shouldn't be so frightened that our neighbors and our neighboring countries and people there are seduced by the Bukele model, because it has happened in the past. And about how do you educate people to come to different conclusions? I have had a hard time because people like marketing people have told us, stop talking about human rights. It doesn't resonate. People don't know what it is. And it's weird for me because like the very first things that I did when I was in El Salvador were do human rights workshops in communities of demobilized guerrilla units, the families from demobilized soldiers, repatriated refugee communities. And other communities that didn't have that same historical background. I don't remember in any human rights workshop talking with people who had no idea about rights and who didn't at the same time hold those aspirations as their own. I don't remember ever being in a human rights workshop where someone was like, you know what, man, you're right. I wouldn't like to have equal participation in the political process. That doesn't sound good to me, right? Like that was even kind of theoretical, but, and so like, what is the process of change? I think I talked about it before, is trying to meet people where rights become, needs, and where, the defense of rights and democracy is linked to their freedom and and survival, because it's true. I say that it's true because when the state of exception started, we opened an online platform for people to denounce abuses. And we would get in a night, 500. And so then we organized our legal team to try and reach out to all the people and give them advising and try and deepen the testimonies. And when we explain to people on those phone calls that they don't have rights, that people, what they wanted is for us to help get their people out of prison. And when we explain to them that the reforms make that impossible, that the state of exception takes away their due process rights so that they would be able to get their people out of prison soon, they got mad at us. That's an interesting finding, no? People say, "Oh, nobody believes in the democracy before, and all the Salvadorans don't think that it worked for them." But at the start of the state of exception, they all thought that if their family members were innocent, that the justice system would release them. That's a pretty interesting finding. And then what they did is they went to the prisons to try and find where they were. And then they went to the public defender's office to see if someone was going to defend them. And then they went to the attorney general's office to see if they were going to be tried or convicted or accused of something. And then they would go to the human rights ombudsman. And then the president created a human rights commissioner from this weird guy from Colombia. And they would present their case files and all the criminal background stuff to prove that they had nothing to do with gangs. And then they came back to Crystal Cell and they said, what do we do now? Because they went to all the institutions that were set up to protect rights, to check executive power, and realized that they were co-opted, and they were co-opted against them. And when they realized that, the only alternative that they really had to continue to advocate was to organize. And when you realize that the whole state that was set up originally to protect you is against you, then the only thing you have to keep yourself safe and to continue advocating for the freedom of your family member is to find solidarity with people in a similar situation. So sadly, one of the best ways to educate people is when those things that they didn't know that they needed desperately are gone. The rule of law is abstract until you need it. And so part of that means also that we cannot judge people, because in the moment that we find them. They don't agree with everything that we think of, or that we think, that they assess reality differently than we do, because at the end of the day, as they lose rights, they will also do new conclusions, right? And so I hear that a little in the U.S. I know it's hard. It's really, really hard. And all the families are divided. People can't talk to each other. But we have to find those places where rights become materialized in our needs as people. And we have to be patient with people as they realize the best ways to secure those needs are not necessarily putting their faith in a single person and trusting them with all of the power, rather in a messier process in which we dialogue, we differ, we come to consensus, where power is limited and change is slow, but the cost on human beings is less.
And I think this will probably be our last question, right? We are till 1:30. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Flores y Asensio. I'm a Mayan Ahuachapaneco from my father's side, and a Nonualca from my mother's side, and in the state of La Paz, El Salvador. Thank you very much for your exposition. Thank you very much for all your work you've been doing. I want to take you on the part that you say the organizing is a tool for us as Salvadorians to continue this struggle. The indigenous people back home is the ones who has not been just repressed directly, as has been the environmentalists, the human rights organization, but I believe we're next. Specifically because the land issues that were given to, after the war, that were given to the former guerrilla and army people. I have friends living right now in different land that was given is in a peace accord. And I'm afraid that eventually they will have to be removed from that lands because development and whatever Mr. Bukele has in mind. So I'm here in the U.S. at this time around to work in a campaign and coordinate an international committee on the 1932 genocide that is coming, the 100 years is coming next, in 2022, of course. So I've been working and talking to the diaspora because I think that there are a whole new generation of academics and professors now, Salvadorians specifically, in Los Angeles. They're really to engage in these questions and also are asking the hard questions. So when you say that Cristosal should switch gears and help organizations, how willingly you are to help us organize the 100 years anniversary of the genocide from 1932 in El Salvador. One. And next year, 2027, we hoping to hold a conference with the diaspora, displaced, apátridas, exiles like myself at one point, and repatriados, in the hope to find a unified voice between the people back home who have been being displaced or are about to be displaced, and the people in the diaspora. So we're planning to have a conference on March 2027 And we need all the help we can get. And moving towards the 100 years anniversary with the help of the diaspora. So I would like to know if you will be interested to talk to me after this or in the near future.
Yes. And congratulations. That's really important. I remember the 25th anniversary was the first time the Salvadoran government, during Mauricio Funes, recognized the genocide happened. In the state of exception in El Salvador, the families of leaders of indigenous organizations in the west of the country were captured. The ones that are opposing the represa, the dam, and also in the east, an organization of communities that was opposing the forced eviction because of the Bitcoin City plans and the airport in the east. They're called Milpa. And a lot of those leaders had to flee the country at the end of last year. And so indigenous organizations in El Salvador are not as strong and visible in Guatemala, but in the defensive territory have recently become important actors and also suffered repression. We before we left El Salvador, were working very closely with emerging social movements and organizations of victims. We created a model of sort of organizational strengthening and accompaniment, combining legal empowerment, really kind of basic tools for doing collective assessment of risks, security plans, spokespeople training. We decided that NGOs were not our partners, principally because at the end of the day, when there's risk for advocacy, your best partners are the ones that have to advocate because their lives and freedoms depend on it. And so we began to partner much more with social movements like that, and we maintain those lines of contact with them. And we would be honored to be a part of marking memory of the 100th anniversary, also because that belongs to the people and not the regime. And so it's important for the people to be able to have the opportunity to tell that story on their own terms. President Bukele went to Mozote 3 times in a helicopter to say that the peace accords were a farce, that the war was a farce, that the Association of Victims is a fraud, and that Crystal South's lawyers are a fraud. It was his way of saying that nothing that come before me is legitimate. But that's an abuse of historical memory. And so I think what you're doing is really important. We also see the example of, Hector Lindo is a professor here at Fordham, and he's become like a social media star because he never talks about Bukele, but every time Bukele does some sort of authoritarian power grab or whatever, he'll just grab like cuttings from the newspaper in 1930 or 1940 or 1950 or 1960, showing exactly how some other dictator did exactly the same thing. And so sometimes it's better, in order to do the education part, to talk about who we were rather than who we are. And once we see who we were, it becomes evident who we're becoming. So I congratulate you, and if we can be helpful, I can't promise things that I don't have, but let's talk. And if we don't have time to talk now, we can give you my contact information.
I think we're probably, unfortunately, over time, and there are questions in the Q&A box, so I'm sorry we couldn't get to them, but this has been fantastic. Professor Edelman, I don't know if you have any closing words.
No, just to thank Noah in particular for this very important presentation.
Thank you all. And there is a question up there, what can be done? I would make one ask. Our political prisoners need your solidarity and support. We are asking 3 things right now. One, that they have a right to public trials. Ruth, Alejandro, Enrique, Jose Angel have all of their processes, all of the prosecution against them their trials have been declared secret. 2, we're demanding the right to family visits and access to their defense attorneys. And we think that these 3 requests, they sound like they're so minimal, so low, but they're useful communications tools. If all I'm doing is asking for something so basic, the injustice that they're doing against my friends becomes apparent. And so I would ask you all to help us make that ask to your representatives, to anyone who will listen, to follow us on social media and help keep them visible, and keep the political pressure on, so that we can find a solution for their freedom in the near future. So that would be the thing that I would like to leave as an ask. Thanks for asking for what you can do.
So thank you everyone for participating.